9 of the 10 commandments hand you nothing. No reward, no payoff, just the command. Then the 5th one shows up carrying a promise. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Long life. Land you actually get to keep. Strange thing to dangle in front of a 7-year-old. Except it wasn't dangled in front of a 7-year-old. Kids don't lie awake at night doing math on whether they'll still be alive in 40 years. They don't own property. They can't lose a family plot they never held the deed to in the first place. Whoever this reward was aimed at, it was someone with enough life stacked up behind them to actually worry about what's ahead. So, who was standing at the base of that mountain? Grown men, grown women, herders with flocks, heads of households who'd walked out of Egypt with elderly parents leaning on their arms the entire way. People with land coming to them. Land they hadn't set foot on yet. Land they could already picture losing. Scholars who study the 10 Commandments as a legal document have pointed this out for years, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every other command on that list assumes an adult. Small children don't carve idols. They don't plot murder. They don't commit adultery or lie in a property dispute. The whole list is talking to people old enough to do real damage, which means the 5th one is too. There's a second version of this commandment, and the wording shifts. 40 years after Sinai, the older generation buried in the wilderness, a younger one standing at the edge of the Jordan. Moses repeats the 10 in Deuteronomy. This time it reads, "Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long, and that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you." Deuteronomy 5 verse 16. He adds a phrase, that it may go well with you. Life and the quality of life tied together, handed to a generation about to inherit a country. These people were going to divide land by family. Plots that stayed in the clan, passed down, marked with boundary stones, defended for centuries. Their whole future ran through the household. So a command about how families treat their oldest members carried the weight of national infrastructure. Now, the Hebrew word underneath our English word honor has almost nothing to do with saying yes ma'am at dinner. It's a word about weight. The verb is kabed, and its root means heaviness, something dense, something with mass, something you can't just shove aside. When Genesis says the famine was severe, that's this root, the hunger was heavy. When Moses tries to talk his way out of the burning bush by saying he's slow of speech, the Hebrew literally calls him heavy of mouth, heavy of tongue. When Pharaoh refuses to let Israel go, his heart gets described the same way, weighed down, immovable. The word even shows up describing an actual body. When the priest Eli falls backward off his seat and dies, we're told he was old and heavy. Same root. No metaphor, just mass. And here's the thing, those same 3 letters give Hebrew its word for glory. Kavod. God's glory is his weight, his substance, the sheer there-ness of him. When Israel talked about the presence filling the tabernacle, this is the word they reached for. Something so real it presses on the room. So, the command borrows the exact language Israel used for God's own presence, and points it at 2 people you've probably argued with over dinner. Give your father and your mother weight. Treat them as substantial. Let them count for something in your decisions, your words, and where your money goes. Now watch the other side of the scale. The opposite of kabed is kalal, to be light, slight, trivial, to make weightless. And kalal is exactly the word Exodus uses 1 chapter later, in a line that should stop you cold. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. Our English word curse makes us picture someone shouting something ugly. The Hebrew is quieter than that, and colder. It means to treat a person as nothing, to make them light enough to blow away. 2 pans on a scale, heavy on one side, weightless on the other. Israel was told which side to load. That penalty belonged to Israel's civil code as a covenant nation. Nobody was handed a personal license to enforce it. What it tells you is how seriously the God of Israel took contempt aimed at a parent. Which is exactly why this commandment can't just be swapped out for the word obey. Hebrew has perfectly good vocabulary for listening and obeying, and the 10 Commandments don't reach for it here. When Paul writes to the church at Ephesus, he actually keeps the two ideas separate in the same paragraph. First, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Then he shifts and quotes the commandment itself. Honor your father and mother. Obedience belongs to the season when you're under their roof. Honor never expires. A 40-year-old woman doesn't owe her mother obedience about which job to take. She owes her weight. So, what did that weight actually look like in an Israelite village? Strip out everything modern for a second. No pension, no retirement account, no assisted living, no check arriving on the 3rd of the month. In the ancient world, an old person survived because their adult children fed them. That was the whole system. Historians working with legal documents from the ancient Near East find this everywhere. Contracts spelling out which child owes food, oil, wool, and shelter to an aging parent, adoption agreements that exist specifically so a childless couple will have someone obligated to care for them at the end. Honoring a parent wasn't mainly a feeling. It was an economy. The obligation didn't stop at the grave either. Joseph honors an oath to his father Jacob at enormous cost, leading a funeral procession all the way from the Nile to Canaan to bury him with his fathers. That's the 5th commandment operating before anyone had written it down. Land, burial, name, care of the old one braided rope. Pull out any strand and the whole household unravels. Which is why Proverbs keeps circling back to old age specifically. Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. That second half is the pressure point. Nobody despises a healthy, capable, contributing mother. The temptation shows up later, when she repeats herself, when she needs help standing, when caring for her costs you time and money you'd rather spend somewhere else. Proverbs isn't gentle about it. One of its harshest images lands on the person who sneers at a father and refuses a mother. Ravens of the valley coming for the eye that did the sneering. Ancient Israel treated contempt for a parent as a threat to the whole community, because a society that discards its elderly has already decided people are worth exactly what they can produce. That's the ledger. The 5th commandment is written in bread, shelter, and dignity. Quick word, if studies like this one are useful to you, subscribing keeps them coming, and it costs you nothing. Read as a personal guarantee. That verse turns into cruel arithmetic. Call your mother, get more birthdays. Neglect your father, die young. Anyone who's buried a faithful person far too young knows the equation doesn't hold. Scripture knows it too. Josiah was one of the most devoted kings Judah ever had, and a battle wound killed him before he turned 40. So what's the promise doing? 2 things working together. First, the language is a covenant language about a nation. Deuteronomy uses this same phrase, long days in the land, over and over, applying it to the whole body of God's instruction, not just this one command. Israel's future in Canaan depended on whether they'd live the way God showed them, and how they treated the vulnerable sat near the center of that. Second, the promise describes how communities actually work. A culture that honors its elderly builds something that lasts. A culture that treats old people as dead weight is teaching every young person exactly what happens to them the moment they stop being useful. Whatever you model, you're likely to receive, and everybody in that village knew it. None of which turns the commandment into a strategy. God attached a promise the way a father attaches a reason when he explains something to a child he loves. Here's what I'm asking. Here's what it builds. Paul quotes this verse centuries later, writing to believers with no stake in Canaan at all, and adjusts the ending. It will go well with you and you'll live long on the earth. The specific plot of ground drops away. The principle stays. There's also his puzzling line. This is the first commandment with a promise. Only here does a specific blessing get spelled out, attached directly to the keeping of one particular command. Out of everything God could have singled out, he chose this. Jesus takes the fifth commandment somewhere uncomfortable, and it happens during an argument about hand-washing. Religious teachers from Jerusalem question why his disciples ate without the ceremonial rinse their tradition required. He answers by putting a different practice under the light. Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, a gift dedicated to God, an offering set apart for the temple. A man could declare his property or income consecrated. Once he said the word, those resources were off-limits for ordinary use, including feeding his elderly parents. He didn't even have to hand the money over right away. He just had to say it. And with one religious formula, the obligation to his mother and father evaporated while the wealth stayed sitting in his hands. There's a thread easy to miss on a first read. Before Jesus ever mentions parents, he quotes Isaiah to these men. These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Honor, the same word, aimed at God. Then he turns and shows them a practice that strips honor from a father and mother. Two failures. One word connecting them. Weightless worship on one side, weightless parents on the other. Jesus doesn't soften it. He quotes Moses first. Honor your father and mother. Then the harsher companion text, about anyone who speaks contemptuously of a parent. And then he names what they've done. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. Look at what that accusation assumes. For it to land at all, honoring a parent has to mean supporting them materially. The charge is financial. Money that should have gone to feeding an aging couple got rerouted through a religious loophole. Jesus puts a price tag on the word honor. Paul says something just as blunt to Timothy. Children and grandchildren should first make some return to their own family, because this pleases God. Then he escalates. Anyone who refuses to provide for their own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Not a gentle nudge. Early Christians understood that caring for your parents was part of following Jesus, and that skipping it while staying religious was a contradiction serious enough to name out loud. Nobody was sneaking around the commandment here. They climbed over it on a ladder built out of religious language. It's possible to be busy with holy things, and use that busyness as your excuse for the phone call you haven't made. Centuries before that argument in Galilee, a prophet used the fifth commandment as an accusation against a nation, and aimed it upward. Malachi opens with God speaking to priests whose worship had gone sloppy, bringing him blind and lame animals, offerings they wouldn't have dared hand to a governor. God makes his case with a household comparison. A son honors his father and a servant his master. If then I am a father, where is my honor? Kabed again. The weight word. God asking Israel to apply their own family standard to him. The argument only works because everyone listening already agreed a father deserves honor, which quietly answers a question people ask about this commandment. Why does a household rule sit alongside prohibitions against idolatry and murder? Because the family is where a person first learns what honor even feels like. Long before you can think of God as Father, you're learning it from someone at eye level, what it means for another person to be substantial, what it means for someone to matter when they can't do a thing for you. Plenty of people watching know from the inside what it's like to get that wiring crossed early, which may be part of why God keeps introducing himself as Father to people whose own fathers failed them. The first version you were handed doesn't get to set the ceiling on what you can know about him, which raises the question everyone eventually asks. Does honoring a parent mean doing whatever they say, forever, no matter what? Scripture says no, and it says so without ever weakening the commandment itself. Jesus, at 12 years old, stayed behind in the temple while his parents traveled a full day toward home. When Mary finally found him, he answered that he had to be about his father's business. He wasn't being flippant, and Luke tells us he then went back to Nazareth and lived in submission to them for years. Both things are true at once. A claim from God can override a parent's plan, and honor continues anyway. Later he says something sharper still. Whoever loves father or mother more than him isn't worthy of him. Family sits high. It doesn't sit highest. When the apostles were ordered by the authorities to stop speaking about Jesus, Peter answered that they had to obey God rather than men. That principle covers every human authority, parents included. So honor has a ceiling. If your mother tells you to do something God forbids, wait doesn't mean compliance. Israel knew this from the beginning. Deuteronomy warned that even a family member could try to pull you toward other gods, and loyalty to God outranked loyalty to blood. The commandment hands a parent a permanent claim on your respect, your care, and your speech, not unlimited authority over a grown adult's conscience. You can disagree with your father completely and still refuse to make him weightless. You can decline his advice and still show up when he needs a ride to the hospital. Then the hard case. It would be dishonest to write a whole study on this commandment and step around it. Some of you watching had a father who terrorized you. Some had a mother who should never have been trusted with a child. The Bible doesn't hand you a rule that requires walking back into danger. Ezekiel is explicit. A child isn't bound to carry a parent's guilt or repeat a parent's pattern. Wisdom is allowed here. Sometimes it looks like distance. What honor looks like in that situation runs quieter, slower, refusing to let bitterness define you, declining to speak of them with contempt to everyone who'll listen, praying for a person who never prayed for you, doing what can be done safely from whatever distance protects you, and leaving the rest with God, who saw all of it and hasn't forgotten. That's weight carried a different way. One moment near the end of John's account reads differently once you've spent time with this commandment. Jesus is on the cross, hours from death, suffocating slowly, carrying the weight of the world's sin. Below him stands a small group, and among them his mother. He looks at her, then at the disciple beside her. Woman, behold your son, and to the disciple, behold your mother. John adds a detail that's easy to rush past. From that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Not a sentiment, a transfer of responsibility. Mary was almost certainly a widow by then, and in that world, a widow without a son to support her was one bad season from destitution. Jesus, the oldest, was about to be gone. So he arranged her care. In agony, minutes from dying, he made sure his mother would eat. The Son of God kept the fifth commandment with some of his last coherent words. He doesn't hand her to a brother, doesn't leave it to relatives to sort out. He gives her to a disciple, which tells you something about how he understood the family gathering around him. Responsibility for the vulnerable, moving into a new household, one built out of people who followed him. If you ever wondered whether this was one of the smaller commandments, watch where it shows up. So what does giving weight look like on a Tuesday? Start with speech, since that's where contempt usually surfaces first. The way you talk about your parents when they aren't in the room says more than the way you talk to them when they are. There's a real difference between telling a friend you're struggling and turning your father into a running joke. Then there's money and time, the part Jesus made unavoidable. For some of you that means writing a check. For others it means the harder currency. Driving over on a free afternoon you'd rather have kept. Sitting through the same story for the fourth time without letting your face give it away. Corban, in reverse, instead of finding a reason the resources aren't available, you make them available. There's the strange grief nobody warns you about, too, when the person who used to decide things for you can't decide anymore, and you have to take over while somehow leaving their dignity intact. You'll do it imperfectly. Do it anyway. Watch for the modern version of Corban. Almost nobody today declares assets consecrated to a temple, but plenty of us have a schedule so full of good, important obligations that there's nothing left over, and the parent gets whatever remains. Nothing about the loophole in Mark 7 looked crude. It looked respectable. Ours usually does too. If your parents are gone, honor doesn't end. You can speak well of them. Keep what was good in them alive in how you live. Forgive what needs forgiving. And if the relationship was complicated or broken, this commandment isn't a rope around your neck. Read it instead as an invitation to refuse the easy path of writing another human being off entirely. The fifth commandment was spoken to adults holding the future of a nation in their hands, standing at the edge of a land they hadn't entered yet. Give your father and your mother weight. Let them count. Feed them. Defend their dignity. Speak of them like they matter. Refuse to treat them as light. A people who learns to do that with the old and the fragile will treat everyone else better too. That's the road to long days in the land. Worth noticing what God didn't say. He didn't make the command conditional on how good the parents were. He didn't attach an escape clause for difficult families, and every family in that camp had its share of difficulty. The instruction assumes flawed people on both sides of the relationship and asks for weight anyway. Every one of us was carried by somebody before we could walk. The commandment simply asks, what happens when the carrying has to go the other direction? If this study gave you something worth keeping, subscribe so the next one finds you, and drop a comment underneath. Even one word helps more people discover these studies than you'd think. Send it to someone who's caring for a parent right now. They may need it more than anyone. The Bible is deep. It doesn't have to be complicated.